it seems that no discussion about the Holocaust, for that matter, for any suffering, is meaningful without addressing the question of tzaddik v'ralo. Tzaddik v'ralo is a bit of a misnomer, and let me explain why that is. Tzaddik v'ralo, if you take it on its technical level, means that we're asking the question of how it is that a perfect tzaddik could still suffer. And while that question is philosophically interesting, theoretically interesting, it isn't terribly practical, because we're not dealing with perfect tzaddikim. So what we're dealing with really is the question of a system in the world that seems unfair. System that seems unfair. It seems as though there should be justice in the world, that things should be good for good people and things should be bad for bad people. And I just want to make a little comment about that feeling of justice. Why do we have that feeling? Why is it that we feel a desire, a need, an urgency? It moves us to that there should be justice, that good things should happen to good people and bad things should happen to bad people. Noam, could you post the link onto the onto the group? Thanks. The idea that the world should be a fair, just place is fascinating, because where do you find it? Where do you find any evidence of justice in the world? The big ones eat the small ones. Where do you find any evidence that gives you the sense that you should have almost a concern or a complaint if things aren't fair or just? And yet, right from a very young age, that's what we do. He got a bigger piece. Why do I have to go to bed now? He doesn't have to go to bed now. Where did it come from? What is it there for? Why does it bother us? And the answer is that it's one of Hashem's calling cards that he left inside us so that we can know that there is a thing called schar va'onesh, that everything in the end will be perfectly and absolutely just. Let me just make this clear. For us to know that there is justice requires that we look outside of this world. We have to look at Olam Haba. We have to look at Nitzchias. Otherwise, we couldn't possibly talk about justice. Because for all of the years that there have been people on the world, there's never been justice. Every once in a while, so the good guy gets something good that happens to him, and the bad guy gets something bad that happens to him, and we feel a sense of relief. But if you look at the whole picture is not sustained on that, on those incidents. And so the existence of our drive for justice, for fairness, is a way for us to relate to and to turn to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. the same can be said for our desire for eternity, to leave some sort of something that lasts beyond us, whether it's having children, building buildings, etching our initials into an ancient tree trunk, putting our hand onto a sidewalk as it's drying, to leave some sort of mark that we were here. Is, see, why do you need to leave a mark that you were here? And the answer is because there's a part of us that somehow feels that we can't just end. And that feeling has no support or basis in the world that we see. Everybody ends. And so these are calling cards, particularly eternity and justice, are calling cards that HaKadosh Baruch Hu leaves with us because we have a neshama Torah. HaKadosh Baruch Hu leaves those calling cards so that we can know that there is justice and that there is eternity. So that's just by way of a preface. The fact that it even irks people, that it bothers people, that good people are not getting good things and that bad people don't seem to get the bad things, that is itself a sign of an active neshama. If a neshama had died, chas v'shalom, or in the case of people whose neshamas are completely corrupted, for the Nazis, they weren't worried about justice nor about eternity. It's a sign of a healthy neshama that the issue of eternity and the issue of justice bothers the person. It activates the person. And it's supposed to. So just by way of preface, if you feel the question of, it doesn't seem fair, it's a sign of a healthy neshama. With that said, there are very meaningful and important answers to the question of how it is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world. So it's not just about why good people sometimes suffer, why evil people sometimes flourish. It is, to what degree can I understand Hashem's workings in the world? Now, this is an important point. Chazal tell us that the book of Eov, all 41 prakim, all 42 prakim of the book of Eov, that the book of Eov was written by Moshe Rabbeinu. It's the only book in Nach that Chazal say was written by Moshe Rabbeinu. Why was it so important for Moshe Rabbeinu to receive at Har Sinai, to receive the book of Eov, and to pass it on to us? And the answer is because there is nothing more important than in our relationship with Hashem than knowing about Hashgacha Pratis. And the Sefer goes on giving many, many insights. The simplest insight is that Eov suffers because of some Averos. Maybe even Eov is suffering because he's a Rasha. That, in the end, gets rejected. It's true that it would justify suffering, but that gets rejected. And instead, we learn that a person can suffer for a variety of reasons. The first group of those reasons human beings can know, and they are satisfying reasons. The rest of them we don't know, but because we have the ones that we do know that are satisfying, we are able to rely on our relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu for the rest that we don't know. It's not like we're then left with nothing and just casting our lot with Hashem. People who do that are not greatly praised in the book of Iyov. You don't get great merit for not trying to understand the ways of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the world. That's not going to get you very far. To a certain extent, it means that you don't really believe that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is operating in the world in a manner of Hashgacha Pratis, where he's monitoring, he knows everything that's happening to us, he is monitoring everything that is happening to us, and he is interacting with us on a day-to-day, moment-to-moment basis. So we do need to know about Hashgacha Pratis, and we can't just leave it to who knows. That is a convenient answer, but it's a cop-out. It avoids having a real relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu. Real relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu it's a complex system. To the extent that I can understand it, I do understand it, and that is satisfying. To the extent that I don't understand it, I can rely on the Kadosh Baruch Hu, because what I do understand is sufficient. So just give you one basic example. In order for a person to get Olam Haba, he needs the combination of suffering plus tshuva. That's the magic combination. Needs suffering plus tshuva. So that suffering alone doesn't do the trick. It's suffering plus tshuva. And sometimes a person may have suffered, but didn't do tshuva. And so they need to come back to suffer again in order to do tshuva this time. They suffered, perhaps, but they didn't do tshuva. Tshuva means using the suffering to build an enhanced or an intensified sense of a Kadosh Baruch Hu's presence and relationship in my life. To know more about a Kadosh Baruch Hu, to relate more closely to a Kadosh Baruch Hu. Tshuva means that I integrate a Kadosh Baruch Hu into my life to a greater degree than I did before, and as we've said many times, as both Avinu and Malkeinu. So the process of suffering, which allows the person to see HaKadosh Baruch Hu as Avinu and Malkeinu, it must be accompanied by, and therefore I have taken steps in my life to align myself more closely with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So if a person, for example, was given the gift of suffering and then did not take advantage of that gift of suffering, and instead of doing tshuva, the person maybe even rebelled or tried to fight it in ways that were not appropriate, they went to rely on others other than HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then the suffering the person needs to come back, and that can happen up to 3 times. Chazal, the Pasuk in Iyov tells us that can happen up to 3 times. In other words, the person's original life, and 3 more rounds, all of which are designed so that the person would be able to suffer, to take in his world, and to come to a different conclusion. The conclusion of tshuva, of strengthening his relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu, as opposed to doing what he did before, which was the same suffering, but without doing tshuva. And since those 2 ingredients are necessary in order to have an eternal relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu gives the person additional opportunities. I would just mention that I think that it is reasonable that if we look at the suffering, whether it's our own or the suffering of others, and we use that to do tshuva, to enhance our relationship with Avinu and Malkeinu, we elevate that person's suffering. We've turned that suffering into more meaning. And so if we think about the people who suffered and those who died in any situation, situations that are current, in the situations such as the Holocaust, and we use that suffering as a trigger for tshuva, then we elevate that suffering. And so it builds on this system where you need to have a combination of suffering and tshuva. So the introduction that I wanted to just to put out there tonight is that the story is not about Tzaddik Virala. That's the extreme case. Of course, it is addressed by the concept of Gilgul, of coming back, where a person would come back again to suffer in order to be able to do tshuva, to incorporate the other component into their life. But it's the idea that everything that goes on in our lives is calculated as Hashgachas Hashem. And it's important here to note that there's a circular system. The more a person integrates Hashgacha into his life, the more Hashgacha there is in his life. And that may feel circular, but that is the lot of a person referred to as a tzaddik. The tzaddik is a person who has incorporated Hashgacha Pratis into his life to the point where he feels drawn to do the will of Hashem, to seek out the will of Hashem, to respond to the love of Hashem, to be engaged with Hashem on a full-time basis. Those people have more evident Hashgacha Pratis in their lives. And it can get to a point where that person can live a life of open miracles. That's not for most of us. But the idea that this system that we're describing has a circular component to it, that the more that the person integrates Hashgacha Pratis into his life, the more he is subject to overt expressions of that Hashgacha, is very clearly established, not just in Sefer Iyov, but throughout Chazal. And it can get to a point where the tzaddik is able to say, what are you worried about the fact that you put vinegar in instead of oil into the candles? The same one who said that oil can burn can say that vinegar can burn. Well, try that at home. See what happens. The wick is likely to go out because it's vinegar. It's not oil. But the Gemara relates that that's not a problem for a tzaddik. That's not an issue because he lives on that plane where HaKadosh Baruch Hu is directly intervening and nature becomes less and less of an impeding factor. Nature is an impeding factor. It causes us to think that there's a natural order other than Hashgacha. And so the more the person is engaged in nature, that means the less they're involved in Hashgacha Pratis. The more the person's involved in Hashgacha Pratis, the less they are caught up with nature. And as a result, Hashem's intervention with them does not take nature into particular account. And so the person is lamala min hateva. He's above the natural order. And so this is a little opening introduction to what we're supposed to be working on. A person should not leave Hashgacha Pratis to just, well, I'm sure Hashem has it all worked out, so I'll leave it up to Hashem. That's not an approach that works. That's why Sefer Iyov was written. I'm very grateful to a fellow Tellstone resident, Rabbi Yehuda Leib Friedman, who wrote a commentary on Eov, translation and a commentary based on the Ramban. Again, not only is Sefer Eov the only place where Moshe wrote another Sefer, Sefer of Nach, but it's the only place that the Ramban went through the entire Sefer al Derech HaPshat to explain the Pshat of the entire Sefer. That is the nature of the importance of learning about Sefer Eov, and so we have a debt of gratitude to Rabbi Friedman for having put that out. Unfortunately, the Sefer is currently out of print. I was just in touch with him tonight about the possibility of seeing if we can get it back into print, and I will turn the recording off and give you an opportunity to respond if you wish.